Hello, Professor Wills here from the Art History Department at Pasadena City College. Well, we're beginning our unit on ancient Egypt. I know when I was back in grade school, that was my favorite era to study, and hopefully that will bring that much excitement to you as well. It's certainly a popular area, and hopefully some of you caught the fantastic King Tut exhibit that came to Los Angeles about a year and a half ago at the California Science Center. That was a lot of fun to check out and a really rare opportunity to see Egyptian artifacts up close. All right, so what's extraordinary about Egypt, of course, is it's one of the most famous, long-standing ancient civilizations that coexisted around the same time of many of the civilizations we've been studying in Mesopotamia. But what you find in that part of North Africa is a region that at one point was divided into a lower and upper Egypt. What they had in common was the iconic Nile River. So similar to the Mesopotamian region with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Nile River was an important artery for transportation, for water, for nutrients as it flooded its banks and sustained all of those agricultural practices that we've been talking about that are the building blocks of civilization. So 31 dynasties of Egypt. There's a pre-dynastic period that I'm going to introduce to you today, but the rest of our content will talk about different eras, the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom Egypt. Each have their own characteristics, but there's a lot of continuity, artistically speaking, between all of them. So you'll see some things change, things ebb and flow in terms of Egyptian aesthetics, burial practices, which of course is one of the things the Egyptians are the most famous for. We all love mummies, we all love discovered tomb stories, that kind of thing. So we'll get into all of that in our unit on ancient Egypt. So that whole, discipline of Egyptology really took off beginning the late 18th and 19th centuries. None other than Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous emperor of France, discovered the Rosetta Stone. And that's not just a software brand that teaches you languages. It was a real thing. And upon it had 3 different languages, including hieroglyphics. That is the written language of ancient Egypt. And it was mysterious up to that point what all of those, linguistic elements meant. But with the Rosetta Stones, they were able to crack that open, and it just exploded the whole discipline of Egyptology, allowing, academics and historians and archaeologists so much more knowledge about this really amazing civilization. So let's move on to our PowerPoints here, and we'll get into a little bit of what I'm talking about with our first era, the pre-dynastic era. And so I'm going to minimize myself, go to the PowerPoint, and open up our initial slide here. Okay, as I mentioned, all of these different eras, this pre-dynastic or early dynasty period is what we're going to talk about in today's mini video lecture. And then we'll get into content on Canvas, our learning platform, about the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. So we're looking at about, 3,000 or more years of time still in the BC era. Moving on to a map, I love to pull up a map so we kind of know what we're talking about here in Eastern North Africa, where you can find Egypt to this day. There is two regional differences to keep in mind. There is an Upper Egypt that you can find toward the south, and then Lower Egypt is more in the north, where the Nile flows into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile, of course, famously the longest river in the world, but it is, those two regions were separate for a long time, and they had, disagreements and rivalries and wars, and what really took Egyptian civilization to the next level is when those two were unified. So that's what happened in this unification or pre-dynastic period. But so we won't be talking yet about pyramids, and of course the Great Sphinx. That's Old Kingdom era. That's coming up next. And nor will we be talking about the famous pharaoh of Egypt, King Tut, or the famous monumental temples, like at the Temple of Karnak. That is a New Kingdom era. Events and artistic expression that we'll get to later in our unit. All right, so moving on here, I wanted to show you a few slides here. Of course, a postcard view of the Nile River. Really just the, as I said, the main artery for that civilization. And a couple of plants you can see along the Nile River are on the left, the papyrus plant. So papyrus plant, you might remember that stationery store at your local mall. It provides a fiber from which can be paper-like product, almost like parchment with animal skin. Papyrus can be created into a pulp that they would use to create these long scrolls like a paper product. But combined with the plant you see on the right, the lotus flower that you would see on, lily pads, maybe at LA's own Echo Park Lake during their Lotus Festival. These are the two most iconic plants of Egypt, and they have symbolic meaning referencing both Lower and Upper Egypt. So that's something we'll see from time to time symbolically in the arts of Egypt. And of course, everybody loves the story of mummies. The whole idea of the afterlife was a really paramount focus for the ancient Egyptians, especially to get their pharaohs or kings, whom they viewed as divine, and had the right to have all of this energy poured into preserving their bodies for their spirit, or Ka, K-A, Ka, but also that Ka or spirit may ascend to an afterlife experience with the immortals, their divine version of heaven. So to do that, of course, mummification was a large part of that process. And so this was a huge technique that was perfected by the ancient Egyptians for the most part, and of course part of the famous tomb discoveries and burials that became increasingly more elaborate as we approach the New Kingdom era. There's a glimpse there of the Rosetta Stone, part of it, and hieroglyphics, of course. So no more cuneiform writing. And then, of course, I just wanted to show you, the fascination with Egypt continues into the 20th and 21st centuries. For those of you who are old movie buffs, you probably checked out Hollywood's very corny version of the movie Cleopatra with, Elizabeth Taylor or Boris Karloff playing the monster, the mummy, and the Ten Commandments, of course, is a spin on the lore of the abuses of Egypt to the Hebrews and all of that, but the sets are fantastic, by the way. The Mummy, of course, is a great kind of, I think, early 2000s movie, if you like a kind of a swashbuckling adventure comedy. Check that one out as well. But it underscores, of course, we just can't get enough of Egypt, even in our entertainment. Let me make myself disappear here for you to read the caption that I'm presenting. So our first object associated with this very early dynastic unification period of Egypt, so this is pre-Old Kingdom, from circa 3000 BCE, is called the Palette of King Narmer. And the Palette of King Narmer is an object that is made of slate, that dark stone they used to use to make chalkboards back in the day. And it is a two-sided object in sculpted shallow or low relief. So you can see it's very low relief, not particularly raised. It's about 2 feet in height. And it depicts this famous King Narmer, who through this palette brags that he's the great unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt into one huge, empire. And so on one side, you see King Narmer. He is wearing the bowling pin-shaped crown of Upper Egypt, and he's holding a club or a mace, and he's about to pummel his enemy, who is clearly, on his knees in surrender. He has he's represented in hierarchy of scale for emphasis and recognizability. We've talked about hierarchy of scale before as key to recognizing the most important person through central placement and enlarged, exaggerated size in a composition. A sandal bearer is a typical kind of servant to the king that you see here holding his sandals. And then what you also find is a god, and the falcon god Horus is depicted here. And Horus has a human arm, and what Horus is holding on to is a hieroglyph that is made up of a side profile view of a man's face. And look at these stalk-like elements. Those are papyrus stalks. So Horus is depicted, as a falcon being one of the noblest of birds. But Horus is associated with being the protector of Pharaoh. So you often see depictions of pharaohs with Horus along with a pharaoh. And he is holding with that human arm a hieroglyph that symbolizes Lower Egypt. So it means that, King Narmer has in control Lower Egypt, with Horus helping out, his special god helper. Now look at this palette. It's organized in registers or bands. Down below here, you see two kind of collapsed humans. Those are conquered enemies that we're looking at kind of from bird's eye view downward, whereas we're looking from side view at King Narmer. And then we have two depictions of, on both sides of the palette, remember each side is slightly different, of the goddess Hathor. She is the cow, female cow-headed, or horned goddess who's believed to be the divine mother of the pharaoh. So when you think about cows giving milk and being nurturing in that way, that's what the Egyptians believed. Okay, moving to the other side here. Oh, I forgot to mention too. I've got a detail shot here. There you go. There is Horus. But what you find on both sides as well is a hieroglyph of a catfish and a palette knife with these column-like elements. That's the name of King Narmer in hieroglyphics. Another register shows King Narmer and his retinue approaching a lined-up array of castrated and decapitated enemies, showing the conquered. Finally, in addition, down below here, we have Narmer in the embodiment of a bull, knocking down a city that's in kind of a U shape, and another conquered enemy. Finally, we love our fantastic beasts, right? So you see the necks of these entwined necks of these two beasts managed by a couple of handlers forming a recess. Well, that's why this is called the Palette of King Narmer, because Egyptians really did wear black eyeliner around their eyes, just like football players put a smudge of black under their eyes to reduce glare. So they think this was a ceremonial object, and there was probably eyeliner they would apply perhaps to something extraordinary, like an effigy of a god or a depiction of a god. But again, concept over naturalism. We're seeing composite view continue in Egyptian art. We're seeing the use of registers and bands continue in Egyptian art. Hierarchy of scale continue in Egyptian art. And of course, a mix of side view and bird's eye view, because again, over and over, we saw that in Mesopotamia, concept rules over naturalism or realism. It's about communicating ideas and concepts over depicting something that's more true to our optical reality, which we're more used to.